My name is Tanya Behrisch, and I'm a co-op coordinator at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia, Canada. And I received a research grant from CAFCE, the Canadian Association for Cooperative Education, to look at why co-op students and exchange students go international. The woman who you see sitting in the foreground here is one of my co-op students within Business Co-op. Her name's Muniba, and she went to work for SAP headquarters near Heidelberg in Germany, and she's taking some time out to look around that beautiful town and really taking in one of the best aspects of going international, which is exploring the surrounding area. I looked at two main research questions. What influences BD business students to complete an international co-op and exchange? And on the flip side, what are the barriers preventing students from going international, either on international co-op or exchange? The outline for my presentation includes looking at the student as a risk taker, which is an identity that we don't often view students with as educators and administrators within the university setting. I will talk about the benefits of going international, which are well documented in the literature as well as talked about anecdotally by students returning from their international adventures and experiences. I will look at how SFU as an institution, as well as the Faculty of Business, demonstrates commitment to increasing student outbound experiences in both international co-op and exchange through credentialism as well as through financial awards. And then I'll look at some of the demographics that came out of the research in terms of what the respondents' profile looks like. And I will compare my expectations, having worked as a co-op professional for 20 years in this area, versus the outcomes from this research. And the two are, in fact, very different. Two significant findings that came out of my research were that students' tolerance for risk and the number of credit hours that they had completed were key indicators of whether they were likely to have completed an international co-op or exchange or stayed home. I had expected students to be much more guided by parents and peers, and what I found is that parents and peers are not important in students' decision making with respect to going international. I'd like to ask you, why should we value risk-taking? This isn't generally an aspect or a personality trait that we celebrate or hold up as something that we want to encourage in students. But I believe risk-taking is important. It allows us to try new things like going international, meeting new people. It builds resilience. It allows us to change jobs and to bounce back from failure, recovering from bad experiences, to improve upon previous experiences, and to seek out new opportunities. I looked at both cooperative education students as well as exchange students going outbound on academic exchanges in this research. So I'd like to distinguish the fairly stark contrast between how these two programs are structured within SFU. International Co-op, or I-Co-op, is embedded into regular co-op throughout the university. So it's not a standalone program. There's one centralized person across campus who works with the co-op programs within each faculty. Most I-Co-op placements are unique. So students, for instance, going to SAP in Germany or HSBC in Hong Kong will have a unique experience. They will not necessarily be following directly in the footsteps of a student who has been placed there before. In addition to that, a lot of international co-ops are one-offs. So they are with a new international co-op employer and they will never be repeated again. So they are unique and they are precedent setting and unfortunately are often not repeated. In contrast with that, we have exchange within BD business, and that is resourced quite fully. There's one full-time dedicated staff within the business faculty dedicated to marketing the exchange program, outbound exchanges, and all exchanges are very highly regulated experiences with official school partners. So we know that when a student goes to Bocconi in Italy, that they will be following very closely in the footsteps of previous students who have gone to that official school partner, for example. Some of the benefits of going internationally on iCo-op and academic exchange are that students report a higher satisfaction with their undergraduate experience. They are reported to be more resilient and adaptable. Employers often say that they prefer students who have had these international experiences because of those attributes. They show a greater cultural awareness because they've stepped outside their comfort zone and had to adapt to somebody else's culture. And generally, students who have had international exchanges or iCo-ops show a higher rate of employment following graduation. So I want to turn your attention to SFU's commitment to international experiential learning. This covers both co-op as well as academic exchanges. SFU has its own international engagement strategy right at the president's level. So there's a commitment throughout the university from the top down to engaging students in outbound international experiences. Within the Faculty of Business, there is the International Experiential Learning Certificate, where students can get a certificate on top of their degree that demonstrates that they've had an international experience, and they've taken also international course content as well as a language component. There are ample bursaries available for both academic exchange as well as international co-ops. So there are financial incentives for students to take advantage of these programs. So the participation rate for these programs are, it's high for business. It's 10% for outgoing academic exchanges within BD Business, and only 1.2% for business students going outbound on international co-ops. The Canadian Association for Cooperative Education, or CAFCE, developed a research grant that is meant to help strengthen the development of co-op education across Canada. My research was supervised by the Associate Dean of Business, Dr. Andrew Gimino, here in BD Faculty of Business, and I developed an online survey that had 40 questions in it, and it was sent out in November 2014 to 3,821 undergraduate students who were enrolled in a business class. And this link was sent through an online student engagement office newsletter that all students enrolled in business classes receive. So 232 students responded to that survey, and of those 232 respondents, 163 were approved business majors. The demographics that I looked at within that questionnaire included number of credit hours students had completed, their gender, their cumulative grade point average, their visa status, so looking at whether they are or were Canadian citizens, permanent residents, or students on study permits. I looked at whether their students are immigrants and the number of languages spoken in the student's home. I looked at students' tolerance for risk and also their perception of risk of both international co-op and academic exchange. So looking at the demographics of the respondents who completed international co-op and exchange, 68% of the respondents had completed neither. So moving forward in this presentation, I will refer to those students as neither completers. Only 10% of the respondents had completed an iCo-op, 19% had completed an academic exchange, and 3% had completed both international co-op and exchange. Looking at students' visa status, 88% of the respondents were Canadian or permanent resident, and only 12% were visa students, so here on a study permit. This is not reflective of BD business undergrads as a whole. It is the visa portion here is smaller than it is actually in reality. So just drawing your attention to the fact that these demographics that I'm showing here are reflecting the respondents to the survey, not the actual undergraduate population. I've worked in cooperative education for 20 years as a coordinator, a program manager, and a project manager. And so I've had 20 years to form expectations about what I would find in this research. My expectation was that students are puppets and they are largely guided by their parents and their peers, also by their visa status, whether they are new to Canada or whether they have been living here all their lives. Also looking at students' desire to return either to their own home region or to their parents' home region, and also languages, the number of languages spoken in the home. What I found from the research was totally different. I found that students are independent risk takers, craving novelty, and that they're not guided by parents nor peers. And I think as educators and administrators, this offers us an opportunity to leverage these findings and to target students who are open to risk, who are open to new opportunities, and to get those students actually moving faster in their university careers. In looking at respondents' reasons for completing iCo-op and exchange, I found that iCo-op completers and exchange completers have very similar motivations. Opportunity to travel and meet new people top both groups' charts. Third down for iCo-op completers is the desire for an international career. That's much higher than it is for exchange completers. And then fourth on co-op completers list is I want international experience on my resume. So opportunity to travel, meet new people, basically a change in my routine, top the motivations for both students completing international co-op as well as those completing an academic exchange. I found also that a higher tolerance for risk was an indicator of whether students were more likely to have completed either of these experiences. And for co-op, a desire for an international career was a fairly significant motivator as well. So I think as educators and university administrators, we should be marketing the novelty aspect of these programs and experiences rather than the academic achievement component of them, which we often find in our marketing materials. When I looked at students' reasons for not completing iCo-op or exchange, too expensive topped both groups' lists. Although this is slightly lower for iCo-op completers, probably because the co-op salary offsets the cost of going international. The second most important barrier for both groups is it would extend my degree too much. So there's a perception that both academic exchange and international co-op would delay a student's graduation to the point where it's going to prevent them from participating in either. Whether that is the case or not is another question, and I encourage you as co-op coordinators and educators to look at dispelling that myth, because students receive academic credit for all the courses that they take on exchange, and they get the equivalent number of credits here at SFU. And international co-op basically takes the same amount of time as a domestic co-op. So the top barriers that I found were cost and time. And then the third highest barrier is the perception that both of these experiences are too difficult to achieve, so why bother pursuing them? This is in spite of fairly significant marketing, particularly on the part of the exchange coordinator here within business, the Faculty of Business. There is also perception that international co-op is high risk, and that exchange has a higher than neutral risk as well. So that is probably playing a part in creating a barrier for students. So what's needed? I think that we need to address the barriers, the perceived barriers of cost, and to market both programs more effectively to students who are open to new experiences. When I looked at risk, I compared risk tolerance between the iCo-op completers, exchange completers, and neither completers. And what I found was that in the high to very high risk tolerance category, that the international co-op completers showed the highest to very highest tolerance for risk. So on this chart, you can see that the blue bar, the longest one in the high to very high tolerance for risk, is representing iCo-op completers. Next down are the exchange completers at 66.7%, and then last in that category are the neither completers. So this chart shows that overall, international co-op completers tend to have a higher tolerance for risk than exchange completers, who tend to have a higher tolerance for risk than neither completers. Another way to compare these three groups is by using some nice pie charts. So this first chart is looking at the risk tolerance of students who completed neither iCo-op nor exchange. And you can see that only 18% of neither completers have a very high tolerance for risk, and 36% of them have a high tolerance for risk. Then you compare this to exchange completers, and they have a slightly higher percentage in the very high risk tolerance category and a much higher percentage in the high risk tolerance category, 46%. So you see a gradual widening of these two categories. And then we turn to the co-op completers, who have an extremely high number of respondents in the very high tolerance risk category, 47%. This is over twice as high as the respondents in the neither completers and the exchange completers groups. And then 35% in the high category as well. So both the very high and high tolerance for risk categories are most populated, most highly populated by the international co-op completers. In addition to risk tolerance, I looked at how students perceive the risk of exchange and the risk of international co-op. Nearly 1/3 of respondents see the risk of exchange as high to very high. When we turn to international co-op, we see that a far higher number of students, or respondents rather, perceive international co-op to be high to very high risk. My conclusion from this is that international co-op is seen by more students as a riskier adventure than exchanges. Another way I looked at risk was looking at how students perceive the risk of a program differently, whether they had completed it or not. So in looking at exchange, you can see in the high to very high category here at the top, the long purple bar, those are students who did not complete an exchange. They're much more likely to see the risk of exchange to be high to very high. Those who have completed an exchange are less likely to see the risk of exchange to be high to very high, which makes sense. Students who have completed exchange down in the low to very low category are much more likely to see that being the risk than students who have not completed exchange. So exchange is perceived to be lower risk by students who have completed exchange and higher risk than students who have not completed exchange, which makes sense. And then we compare this to international co-op and something very different emerges. Students who completed international co-op are most likely to see the risk of international co-op as neutral, not low to very low, but neutral or also high to very high. So this is pointing to the sense that the perceived risk of international co-op, it doesn't vary very much between those who completed international co-op and those who have not. It is still seen as a high to very high risk venture by completers of this program. My conclusions about perceived risk are that co-op is seen to be riskier than exchange. Completers of neither program perceive the highest risk of both programs. And students who've completed international co-op perceive international co-op to be neutral risk, whereas exchange completers perceive exchange to be low to very low risk. Both international co-op and exchange are the domain of senior students. So those are students who have 90 or more credit hours towards their 120 required credit hours for graduation. 88% of co-op completers are senior students in that category. I found that 3/4 of students who hadn't completed either an international co-op or exchange wished that they could. And there seemed to be an inverse relationship between the number of credit hours that a student had completed and their wish to complete an international co-op. So, for instance, a student having lower credit hours showed a stronger desire to do international co-op sometime in the future, whereas a student who had higher credit hours showed less of a willingness or a desire to do that. This leads me to conclude that the dream of international co-op is more alive in junior students because their futures are still forming at the institution. They haven't totally set out their path or exactly where their degree is going to take them, so it still remains a possibility and opportunity. For exchange, the wish to do an academic exchange was more evenly distributed between junior, intermediate, and senior students. Some surprises and conclusions from this research. Some surprises and conclusions from this research. First, students who completed international co-op perceived international co-op to be high to very high risk. Second, students who completed international co-op perceived international co-op to be low to very low risk. Third, students who have completed international co-op perceive international co-op to be neutral or high to very high risk. Fourth, students who have completed international co-op perceive international co-op to be high to very high risk. Fifth, students who have completed international co-op perceive international co-op to be low to very low risk. Some surprises and conclusions from this research. The craving for novelty overrides students' family background. That's what students are most hungry for when they decide to pursue an international co-op or an exchange. Completers of either program tend to be high risk takers. They have a higher tolerance for risk, and both programs are really the domain of senior students who are past the middle point of their undergraduate degrees. And also something I think that we should notice is that the majority who have not completed either an international co-op or exchange wish that they could. So there are some big regrets there, or hopes as well, where students remain open and plastic to these experiences, and that door closes the more senior that they get in their degrees. The more surprises and conclusions include that 12% of the respondents reported that staff or faculty within business discouraged them from participating in either international co-op or exchange. I found this alarming and brought this to the attention of our associate dean. He was very interested to hear that. We also found that exchange is promoted more effectively than iCo-op, which makes a lot of sense since it is resourced much differently than iCo-op, and there's a centralized full-time staff person within the Faculty of Business solely dedicated to promoting and managing exchanges for business students. As well, financial assistance is cited as the number one action needed to increase uptake of both programs. So how can co-op and this university or any university use these findings? I believe that we should be looking at marketing the novelty aspect of these programs to students rather than any other aspect, because this is what turns the students on, and that's what the completers of both programs report as their main motivators for completing international co-op and exchange. I think we should be targeting risk takers, so students who have a higher tolerance for risk, and I think we should be targeting them earlier in their university careers. And I also believe that we need to confront perceived barriers and risks such as cost as well as delay of graduation. I believe that some of these perceived barriers are somewhat real in some instances. For instance, maintaining a domestic or local lease is not covered in some of the bursaries and awards that are available. But there are also many awards that go left on the table and are not even applied for either exchange or international co-op. So some of these perceived barriers are not in fact validated in reality. And then the delayed graduation is also, I think, a myth that we need to be speaking directly to when we're marketing either of these programs. I'd like to thank CAFCE, the Canadian Association for Cooperative Education, and my direct supervisor, Shauna Tonsaker, for supporting this research. I'd also like to thank Andrew Gimino, Rosie Ng, Liana Sweetall, and BD alumnus Brian Nguyen, and the Student Engagement Office Co-op and BD undergrads for supporting this research. And I welcome anybody who is watching this or listening to this to contact me directly. My name is Tanya Behrisch, and my email is right here on this last slide, and I look forward to continuing dialogue on why students go international. Thank you.